Hello, this is Marie from A-level Psychology Tutor. Today I'm going to take you through everything you need to know for coding, capacity and duration of memory. Before we start today's lesson, I'd highly advise that you download the free Cornell notes from the website. This will allow you to make the most effective notes that you can by answering all the key questions in the left-hand margin, which will make sure that you cover all the key elements on the specification. I think it's really important for all students to understand the specification, not only to maximise the marks in the exam, but to also help structure revision. Normally, each bullet point will convert itself to a 16-mark essay. However, some bullet points, such as this one, lends itself to 2. So as you can see, it says features of each door, coding, capacity and duration. That could be an essay in itself, and it could ask you to discuss research into these areas. Or you could get an essay on the multi-store model of memory, which would also require you to talk about some of the research that we will discuss today. Okay, so let's get started with our definitions. Duration of memory refers to the length of time that information can be stored in the memory system, whereas capacity is the amount of information that can be stored in the memory system. Coding or encoding is a process by which the sensory information, that's all the information coming in through the sense organs, is modified or changed and stored in the brain. The most common forms are visual, acoustic and semantic encoding. Visual is encoding through sight, acoustic through hearing and semantic through meaning. There are 3 different types of memory stores: sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory. And they all differ in terms of how they encode information, their duration and capacity. We will start by looking at research into capacity. We'll do the AO1 and then the AO3. We will then look at the research into duration, the AO1 and the AO3, followed lastly by the research into encoding, the AO1 and the AO3. So we'll just start by going through a brief overview on what the research into capacity suggests. It suggests that sensory memory has a very large capacity, and this is because it's taking in all of the information from your sensory inputs, so therefore it needs to hold a large amount of information. Short-term memory has a limited capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 items, and long-term memory has potentially an unlimited capacity. We'll now just take a look at how research actually assess capacity of short-term memory. One common way to do this in a lab-based setting is through the digit span task. You can have a go yourself. What you would do is cover all the rows except for the first one. You'd read the numbers, cover them up or shut your eyes and try and recall the digits. If you manage to do this successfully, you move on to the next one. And then if this happens again, then you carry on to the next one, so on and so forth. When you get a number wrong, you'll stop. Now your digit span is the last one that you record absolutely correctly. So that would be known as your short-term memory digit span. Jacobs, all the way back in 1887, was amongst the first to use this technique of the digit span to assess capacity of short-term memory, and it is the key study that you need for this topic. He found the average span for numbers to be 9.3 items, and for letters, the average span was 7.3 items. Now, the second key piece of research you need for this topic is Miller's magic number. George Miller, in 1956, he reviewed psychological research and concluded that the magic number is 7 plus or minus 2. He found that people could recall this amount of information, whether it be for dots, letters, or musical notes. If we take that finding of short-term memory having a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2, if I ask you to try and remember the digits on the screen in front of you, you'd probably find this quite challenging. If you'd like to have a go at doing this, you can pause the video and quickly test yourself. However, what Miller found is that we can increase our capacity for remembering information if we chunk information together. So chunking is when we find links between information and group them together so that capacity can be increased. Now, if you think about the digits on the previous slide, you may or may not have noticed that there are meaningful links. So there was FBI, AQA, CBA, LOL, ATM and NHS. So once you group the digits together into meaningful links, you can see that there are actually just 6 chunks. So this is how Miller argued we can increase the capacity of our short-term memory. Okay, so we've finished all of the AO1, so we're going to move on to the AO3. We need to be able to evaluate Jacob's research and Miller's research. And you might want to stop and pause the video while you try and think of some of the answers to these questions. So are there any methodological limitations? Did Miller perhaps under or overestimate the capacity of short-term memory? In chunking, does the size of the chunk matter? And finally, do individual differences affect the capacity of short-term memory? So our first evaluation or peel point is looking at the limitation that potentially Miller overestimated the capacity of short-term memory. Cowan in 2001 conducted a review of research and concluded that the capacity of short-term memory is closer to 4 chunks of information. So this estimate falls towards the lower end of Miller's suggested capacity of 5, suggesting that 4 may perhaps be a more appropriate magic number than 7. However, it is important to consider that memory can be influenced by individual differences, and this makes it challenging to draw universal conclusions in this area of research. Another limitation of Miller's research on capacity is the absence of specification regarding the size of the chunk when it comes to chunking. Simon in 1974 discovered that individuals have a smaller short-term memory capacity when dealing with larger chunks of information, such as 8-word phrases, compared to when they're dealing with single-syllable words. This finding suggests that Miller's explanation alone is not sufficient to fully account for the capacity of short-term memory. However, despite this limitation, the research does support the perspective that short-term memory does indeed possess a limited capacity. A further limitation is with regards to individual differences. Jacob's study demonstrated that digit span recall consistently increased with age. On average, 8-year-olds remembered 6.6 digits, whilst 19-year-olds remembered 8.6 digits. This could suggest that brain capacity perhaps increases with age, or that individuals develop improved strategies to actually enhance their digit span as they get older. Therefore, caution should be exercised when generalising research findings on capacity, as age is an individual difference which appears to influence the capacity of short-term memory. The final limitation in this area is a methodological limitation. Many of the research findings in this area lack ecological validity due to the artificial setting in where the research was conducted. Studies by Jacobs and Miller utilised meaningless words, numbers and objects to test participants' recall, and this doesn't accurately reflect how memory is typically used in real-world contexts. In everyday life, memory often carries much more personal significance, such as remembering people's birthdays or recalling daily activities. So therefore, as these tasks lacked mundane realism, the result from lab experiments may only be generalised with caution to real-world scenarios. I'd advise you to pause the video here, and if you haven't already, I would download the topic summary from the website, which you can see on the right-hand side here. I would advise you to add in the AO1 key points that we have already discussed and the AO3 points before moving on to the next section. We will now investigate research into duration. The sensory memory store has a duration of less than 1 second. Short-term memory has approximately a duration of 18 to 30 seconds unless the information is rehearsed. And long-term memory potentially lasts infinitely. Now, the key piece of research that you need for duration of short-term memory is the classic study of Peterson and Peterson 1959, which is also known as the consonant trigram study. So the aim was to investigate the duration of short-term memory, and their participants consisted of 24 university students. They asked their participants to recall a consonant trigram, which looks like the one on the right-hand side, such as TRX, followed by a 3-digit number. Participants had to recall the consonant syllable after 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 and 18 seconds. Now, the easiest way to remember this is it's just your 3 times table. And they asked participants during the time period to count backwards from the 3-digit number, so from 512, either in 3s or 4s, and this was to prevent the maintenance rehearsal so they couldn't repeat the TRX in their mind. The findings of this study showed that after 3 seconds, recall accuracy was 80%. After 9 seconds, this dropped down to 20%, and after 18 seconds, recall accuracy was less than 10%, so most participants couldn't remember anything after this time period. So this led the researchers to conclude that the duration of short-term memory is less than 18 seconds. The key piece of research for duration of long-term memory is Barrick et al. 1975, also known as the Yearbook Study. The aim was to investigate the duration of long-term memory, and this time there was many more participants, 392 from America, aged between 17 and 74. Now their procedure was twofold. They tested photo recognition and free name recall from participants' high school yearbooks. The photo recognition tasks asked participants to name students from 50 photos in their high school yearbook, and the free recall task asked them to list the names of people from their graduating class. Now there are a number of findings associated with this study. I often find too many. I'll go through them all and then I'll tell you which one I'd remember. So for the photo recognition task, participants tested within 15 years of graduation were 90% accurate, and after 48 years the recall was still 70%, so it did decline, but it was still very high considering 48 years had passed, and for me that's the most significant finding that I would use for this area of the syllabus. For the free recall task, after 15 years there was 60% accuracy, and after 48 years 30% accuracy. So it allowed the researchers to conclude that the duration of long-term memory can last a very long time and potentially infinitely. Okay, so once again we've finished the AO1 and we're going to move on to the AO3 this time for duration, and you need to be able to evaluate your key studies. So we've got Peterson and Barrick. You may wish to pause the video whilst you have a think about these questions. So for Peterson, do the results have high ecological validity? Was the task they asked of participants measuring trace decay or displacement? Now, if you've already watched the multi-store model of memory video, you'll know what these concepts are. But just quickly, in case you haven't, trace decay is when information disappears from short-term memory because it's not been rehearsed. Whereas displacement is a different type of forgetting. It's when that store gets full, so when the short-term memory gets full of over 7 items, the new information starts to push out the old information. And moving on to the Barrick study, you might want to think about, do the results have high ecological validity? And were there any more confounding variables than in Peterson? Okay, so I think one of the main considerations or one of the main limitations of Peterson is that it may not have actually been measuring trace decay as intended, but instead they perhaps were measuring displacement. So what we can say here is this lowers the construct validity of the research. Construct validity is assessing whether we're actually measuring what we're claiming to measure. So the researchers were claiming to measure trace decay, but perhaps they were actually measuring displacement. The participants were asked to engage in a distraction task, and this was counting back in 3 or 4s. And if you had a go at this yourself earlier on, you will have found that it's actually quite a complex task to do. So what other researchers have argued is that the complexity of this task could have actually overwritten the trigrams and resulted in displacement rather than solely preventing rehearsal. So it's a methodological limitation. Now Reitman in 1974 conducted a study using auditory tones instead of counting back from numbers, so displacement would not occur. And Reitman found that the duration of short-term memory in this instance was longer. So it suggests that the validity of the results from Peterson was compromised due to methodological limitations. We're going to use a very similar limitation as to what we discussed before, is that Peterson was a lab-based study, so therefore the results lack ecological validity. Again, the stimulus material of the consonant trigrams was highly artificial, it lacked in mundane realism, and it doesn't reflect memory in real life. As we've discussed previously, in real life you've got to remember personal events, friends' birthdays, and these hold more significance compared to nonsensical syllables. However, it is worth noting that in certain everyday situations we do need to remember meaningless information. For example, phone numbers or postcodes or car registration plates. In these instances, the trigram task may be representative of real life demands. So you can say that the results lack ecological validity, or if you want to argue that there is a case on both sides, you could say they have questionable ecological validity. A strength of Barrick's results is that they have high ecological validity compared to Peterson's research on duration. This is because participants' memory was tested on their own high school classmates, which increases the mundane realism and enhances the generalizability of the results at other settings. However, this approach also introduces confounding variables. So for instance, some participants may have frequently looked at their yearbooks, whilst others may not have. This compromises the internal validity of the results, as the frequency of looking at yearbooks may have confounded the results. Therefore, it could be argued that Barrick's research demonstrates high ecological validity, but indeed low internal validity, and these considerations should be noted when generalising the findings. Once again, I would advise you to pause the video here and just complete your topic summaries so you can condense the key information down into AO1 and AO3, and this will help you organise all of the knowledge that you've got to learn for this topic. Okay, we're now back to AO1 for our final section, which is research into coding. Again, I'll just give you a quick overview. Sensory memory is modality specific, which means that it's encoded in the same way that it's received. So if you hear information, it will be encoded acoustically. If you see information, it's encoded visually. Short-term memory typically is encoded acoustically, and long-term memory is typically encoded semantically through meaning. Now, the key study for this topic is Baddeley in 1966. You only need to know one study rather than two, but the research is a little bit more complicated. So I'll try and break it down for you to make it more digestible. I've included a picture of Alan Baddeley, as he's such a prominent researcher in this area, and you'll cover more of his studies as you progress through memory. Now, he asked his participants to recall a list of words, and he split his participants into 4 different groups. There was a group that had to learn a list of words that were acoustically similar, they sounded very similar, and acoustically dissimilar. And then semantically similar words, so they had similar meanings, and semantically dissimilar words. Now, we also asked the participants to recall the words immediately, and this was to test short-term memory recall, and then after 20 minutes, which was a test of long-term memory recall. Now, if you're struggling to explain all that in a couple of sentences, you can just briefly summarise by stating that participants had to learn acoustically and semantically similar and dissimilar words. So hopefully you're still with me. We're just moving on to the findings, which students find the hardest to interpret. So participants had difficulty remembering acoustically similar words when tested immediately using their short-term memory, but had no difficulty remembering acoustically similar words after 20 minutes. Now, if we think about this, short-term memory is encoded acoustically. So when participants had to remember acoustically similar words, what they found is that everything just got muddled up together, and they found this difficult to do. Secondly, participants had difficulty remembering semantically similar words when tested after 20 minutes, but had no difficulty remembering semantically similar words when tested immediately. And the same principle applies. It's because long-term memory encodes semantically. So when you're having to remember semantically similar words, it all gets muddled up, and the participants struggled to do this task. So Baddeley concluded that information is encoded acoustically in short-term memory and semantically in long-term memory. If you're still struggling to understand the findings of the study, sometimes I use an analogy of ball pits. So if we take the red ball pit and the red balls being an analogy for acoustic encoding, if I threw another red ball into the red ball pit and the red ball demonstrated acoustically similar sounding words, and I asked you to retrieve the red ball that I'd just thrown into the ball pit, you'd find this task difficult. However, if I threw the blue ball in and the blue ball represented semantically similar words, then this would stand out more and you'd be able to retrieve the blue ball much easier. So hopefully that hasn't confused you even more, and hopefully one of those explanations has helped you understand this study. We are now on our final AO3 for this whole topic. So you've only got one piece of research, and again you may wish to pause the video. You might want to think about, do the results from Baddeley have good ecological validity? Do you think we always encode information in our short-term memory acoustically? And do you think that we always encode information in our long-term memory semantically? So a strength of Baddeley's findings into coding is that they demonstrate the existence of distinct and separate memory stores, which was a real key finding at the time. And this was evident in the finding that short-term memory was coded acoustically, whilst long-term memory was encoded semantically. And this discovery was groundbreaking at the time, and it played a crucial role in the development of the multi-store model of memory. And moreover, this finding, which supports the multi-store model of memory, has consistently withstood the test of time, making it a reliable and enduring finding. However, a limitation of Baddeley's findings on the encoding of short-term memory is the presence of contradictory research evidence. Brandemote et al. In 1992 discovered that participants actually used visual encoding in short-term memory when they had to engage in a visual task and they were prevented from verbal rehearsal before visual recall. So additionally, Nelson and Rothbart in 1972 found evidence of acoustic encoding in long-term memory. So these findings indicate that encoding is not consistently acoustic in short-term memory, and it's not consistently semantic in long-term memory. And as a result, the generalisation of Baddeley's findings to all types of learning is not equally applicable. And our final AO3 is once again returning to this paragraph about methodological limitations or the results lacking in ecological validity. So I'll let you read through that and take notes yourself. You may just wish to pause the video. If you're an organised student and have been completing your topic summary, you may wish just to again pause the video and complete your topic summary whilst the information is fresh in your mind. So you should now be ready to complete this activity. You may wish to have a go at this yourself. You should be able to differentiate sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory in terms of how they encode information, the capacity of each store and the duration of each store. Here are some potential exam questions in this area. So the first one is a short answer question, which is outline the difference between capacity of short-term memory and the capacity of long-term memory. You would just need to state the capacity of one, use the word whereas the question is asking you about the difference, and state the capacity of the other. The second question is a bit trickier. It's worth 8 marks. Now for all 8-mark essays, which are the shorter essays in psychology, you're going to get 3 marks available for AO1 and 5 marks available for AO3. And for 5 marks for AO3, you're looking at 2 Peel paragraphs. So you'd answer this question by outlining the research that's investigated capacity into short-term memory for 3 marks, followed by 2 relevant Peel paragraphs that we've just discussed. Now, another activity that would encourage all students to do after each subtopic is to either plan an essay or write an essay for that particular bullet point. You can do this yourself just on plain paper, or you could download the essay planning booklet from the website. The benefit of the essay planning booklet, it's got written all of the essay titles in it, and it allows you to keep all of your essay plans in one place and work through them systematically. So the question in the booklet is discuss research into the features of different memory stores. It's worth 16 marks. In the essay planning booklet, it tells you how many marks are available for AO1 and AO3, and it provides a clear structure on what to put in each area. Now, if you're really determined to get the best mark you can, the last task that I'd advise you to do is make some revision notes on this subtopic. When you go through the information again, it encourages you to process it again, and it's more likely to stay in your long-term memory. You could make a mind map, you could just make general kind of linear notes, or you might choose to make some flashcards, for example. But this is a great activity that I would encourage you to do for each subtopic as you progress through the specification. Here is a list of all of the other resources available on the website. They're designed to help you get the best grade that you possibly can, and they all encourage you to work in a really systematic and structured way. If you wish to download the slides, then they're available on the website. If you would just prefer to have ready-made AO3s, there's an A-star evaluation booklet. If perhaps you want to test yourself on what you've learnt today, you might want to download the revision activity booklet. Thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your studies.